What dark facts about World War II people should know about? Germany used prostitutes as bioweapons. Under their rule, any prostitutes who had STIs were imprisoned so they couldn't infect German troops. As Germany started to lose ground in occupied Europe, they would release all of the women in hopes of infecting Allied troops. TBH, I don't remember if this happened in WW1 or WW2. It could very well have been both. The shit the Nazis did to Belarus. They piled entire towns into churches and lit them on fire. They wiped out entire populations in hundreds of towns. They would also allow children to leave the church, seemingly sparing them, then they'd mow them down later after hearing their families screaming. Japan performed horrific scientific experimentation on humans that killed roughly 250,000 in Manchuria. A dozen Nazi department heads got together at a chateau to iron out the details of the Holocaust. It took less than 2 hours. A movie was made about it called Conspiracy. Japanese officers would test their swords on captured American airmen. A veteran I knew personally wrote about some friends who went missing after their B-25 was shot down on a strafing mission. Later, it was revealed they were used as bayonet practice after capture. When they learned their fate, they asked to be shot instead. Each man was bayoneted by a member of the Japanese infantry squad, for a total around 25 times. Other men were beheaded. The existence of Unit 731 and a lot of the other atrocities committed by Japan. It's a common answer on Reddit, but outside of our little echo chamber most people are still totally unaware of just how horrific a lot of what Japan did was. A lot of what Japan did during World War II was every bit as bad as what the Nazis did, and in some instances one could even argue that what they did was worse. Oil is still leaking from the oil bunkers of the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor to this day. During the rape of Nanjing there was a contest between two Japanese officers to see who could decapitate the most people. The January 31, 1945 sinking of the German ship the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. The total casualties are unknown but are estimated at over 9,000, making it by far the worst maritime disaster in modern history. There were mass rapes followed by mass suicides when the Russian army entered Germany. At least 2 million German women are believed to have been raped. It was said every woman from 8 to 80 years was raped by the Russian army. WW2 are the only reasons we know about the stages of hypothermia. The world's nations didn't want their Jews back, they had already moved into their houses' businesses after all. The murder of Jews continued well after World War II ended. Germany fell. This is one of the biggest factors leading to 40 of Israel's Jews having European ancestry. Croatia made people into soap and other stuff that even Germany said calm the FCK down. The number of Nazi officials that came over to work with Allen Dulles and the CIA as the war was ending, thereby avoiding any consequences for their actions. During the Winter War, the Finns put up dead Russian soldiers with sticks as a psychological weapon. A type of scarecrow, or I suppose scared patent pending. Having been in the Iraqi war, I know for a fact atrocities are committed by both sides. The difference is, the losing side has their stories recorded while the winning side has theirs swept under the rug. There are many instances of US soldiers shooting POWs. It's just the way war is. Firebombing of Tokyo March 9, 1945 was the most destructive bombing raid in human history. Despite popular belief, half of WW2 was fought at night. The Katyn Massacre. 22,000 Poles were executed by the Soviets and buried in mass graves. These were military officers and intelligentsia. The Nazis discovered the mass graves. The Soviets blamed the Nazis all the way up until 1990. Adolf Hitler was a big fan of Henry Ford's work and kept a framed picture of him at his desk. A lot of countries were kinda hesitant to take back their Jewish citizens because those folks had already built lives in their new homes. It's really sad, but even after the war was over and Germany was defeated, Jews were still being persecuted and killed. The shit the Japanese were doing in China, not just Nanjing, even made SS officers look away in horror. To this day the Japanese government refuses to admit it ever happened, and most Japanese people were never taught about it in school. Sino-Japanese relations are still soured by that. United States Senator from Minnesota, Ernest Lundeen, collaborated with the Nazis and used his office to push Nazi propaganda through official channels. An agent from Hitler's government even wrote some of his speeches. Canada had Japanese internment and also sent a ship of Jewish refugees back to Europe, where a bunch of them died in concentration camps. The latter isn't something that's taught in schools to my knowledge. Japanese soldiers would bayonet pregnant women. A lot of modern tech piggybacked off the Nazis and Unit 731 medically. Many PPL involved in the Moon mission were Nazis. Our knowledge of hypothermia come from Nazis. The Holocaust started with book bannings. There is a Nazi bunker out there that's dangerously radioactive, meaning they were at least experimenting with nukes. People who survived the atomic blast at Hiroshima sometimes had burns on their skin that matched the light and dark patterns on their clothing. The Nazis were excellent record keepers. We know a lot of what actually happened because they kept great records of all the horrible things they did. But here's the kicker: they knew what they were doing was evil. Oftentimes, when Allied armies were getting close to camps, the superior officers would begin to burn the records. They didn't want the Allies to see what fucked up shit they were doing. They knew they were the bad guys. That's rarely taught. England starved about 4-5 million Indians to death during the war because they refused to slow down their exportation of rice despite a low-yield year, aka the exact same thing they did to India once before and Ireland with the potato. Churchill was directly involved. American GIs sending home souvenir body parts from the corpses of Japanese soldiers was popular in the early Pacific War. I can't remember if a law was passed to outlaw the practice, or if it was already there was a campaign against it in the press. The women who were friendly hooked up with the Nazi troops in their occupied countries were treated horrendously after the war, and their children were too by their own family's people. Denazification is a myth. The guy who led the mob that burned down the synagogue in Cologne is the same guy who denied to permit to rebuild it after the war. Most of the Nazis just went back to their old jobs. It wasn't until the students started getting serious in 1968 that the attitude towards Nazis turns to unacceptable. Nazi drinking songs were sung in bars until then. Guess how long it took for the global population of Jews to return to its pre-World War II number? It still hasn't. That thing about carrots making you see better in the dark. British propaganda bullshit. The Swiss weren't neutral. Hitler used Swiss banks to store the gold of dead Jews. Estimates on just how many lives would have been lost if the Allies had tried to take the Japanese homeland were truly staggering. Although Turkey did not participate in the Second World War, 21,000 Turkish soldiers died. Joseph Mengele was nicknamed the Angel of Death for a reason. The Jedwab Massacre. The non-Jewish populations of some villages in Poland turned on their Jewish neighbors and horribly killed them. Jedwab is the most famous. What about the Japanese cannibalism of American POWs? Many of the Japanese islands were shallow mud covering volcanic rock. So soldiers would die and their bodies would just lay there or get buried in shallow mud and start rotting. Then other soldiers would accidentally step on them or put a hand down not even knowing they were there, and it would just plunge straight through the rotting bodies. I remember reading once that Japanese soldiers in China had a game where they would take Chinese babies and toss them in the air to see who could manage to skewer them on bayonets on the way down. One really sad thing is that when the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, some of the soldiers gave the captives food due to them obviously being completely emaciated. The thing about the human body is that getting a suddenly high food after a long enough time of starving can actually kill you due from the shock, which is exactly what happened to some of them. It was a really tragic element of what happened cause the soldiers were clearly only trying to help, but I guess things don't always work out. Unit 731. Never forget. 2.1 million people died in India because of Britain's denial of rice policy. Unit 731. It made the Nazi concentration camps look like a vacation resort. It was that bad, and one of the reasons the atomic bombs had to be dropped on Japan. It had to stop. It was a crime against humanity in the worst possible way. Look up Japanese Unit 731, they were evil at a